Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the webinar this morning. I can just see that people are starting to arrive, so we'll just give it a couple of minutes as people come onto the screen. Okay, good morning. People are still arriving. That's great. Okay, thank you. Good morning. Hello, bore da. Welcome to the launch of our report today, which is a community response to COVID. Just to remind everyone on the screen, this session is a webinar, so you'll be able to see all the panelists, but you won't be able to see yourselves or the other members of the audience. If you want to ask us any questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you can think of any questions during the session, just type them into the box and the panelists will either type an answer to you during the session, or we'll try to answer them in person at the end, because we'll have about 10 minutes at the end. Also, feel free to use the chat function for general comments and questions. So this is a bilingual session. We have Linwen in the background translating for us, and there's a globe icon at the bottom of the screen. So if you're a Welsh speaker, you need to choose Welsh, and if you want to hear the session in English, choose English. I'm having a few technical problems getting Linwen online at the moment, but hopefully we will get her live once we start the session. So today we're going to be launching the report, A Community Response to COVID. The report was produced by People and Work and commissioned by Building Communities Trust and Llechi Gloa Cefn Gwlad, two organisations that work with communities across the whole of Wales. So on the panel, we've got Duncan Holten from People and Work, who's one of the authors of the research, and he'll be presenting the findings from the report. We'll also get a community perspective from Ben Gregory, who will talk about the response in Penrhos and the surrounding areas. Then we've got Julie and Tyler, who are from Interlink in RCT, and they're going to be speaking about the county-wide response of CVCs and talk about some similar research that they've been doing. And as I said earlier, we'll have some questions at the end. So before we start, just a big thank you to People and Work for producing the report, and also a massive thank you to the hundreds of volunteers from community groups across Wales who've been working so hard to support the thousands of people that have needed it and are still doing it today. So first, we're going to hear from Chris Johns. Chris is Chief Exec of Building Communities Trust, which runs the Invest Local programme, which is a National Lottery Community Fund project working in 13 communities across Wales. Chris is going to talk a bit about how and why we commissioned the research. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Emma. Bore da pawb. It seems quite hard now to think back to where we were in March last year. Both the drudgery and horror of life since then has become sadly normal. But the situation we were in then brought a huge number of very sudden challenges, obviously to health, but also to well-being and in terms of meeting people's basic needs. And as I'm sure all of you know and remember, and many of you took part in, there was a massive response which brought people together across a range of organisations, from formal to very informal, to create and provide the support that people needed to keep them going, and in many cases provide the conditions where people could provide that support for themselves. All sorts of barriers were broken down. There was innovation and new ways of working, and lots of new people involved in community-based work in particular. And lots of stories emerged on this, although it did also depend on people's access to the media. And for an organisation working with community groups like BCT, I think it also validated almost a USP of community organisations who have local knowledge, trust among local people, and strong networks, including to bodies like county voluntary councils and local authorities in many cases. And during this process, both BCT and the Llechi Gloa Cefn Gwlad network were facilitating and supporting networks of community organisations, sharing learning experiences, information, and helping with access to resources. And we also note at the same time, many of those groups were also getting the similar and often complementary support from CVCs, and in some cases local authorities. And in June, we pulled together a fairly quick report based on a workshop, trying to get a picture of some of the things that were going on. And that was valuable, but we also decided that we need to commission much more thorough support to find out actually what was the picture that was emerging from the stories, a true validation of what was going on. And so we got together with People in Work, and it's actually a joint commission between BCT and People in Work to do this report, to test out whether the emerging narrative was true or not. And this is where we got to. Sadly, of course, we're not launching this report as we come out of the pandemic as we might have originally hoped for. Even there is light at the end of the tunnel still feels a very long one. We're actually back into a process where emergency support is still needed, although this time at a community level, it's probably more focused through existing community groups than it is through mutual aid groups. So as we launch this, we probably also need to think ahead about how we retain some of the benefits of working together across boundaries to provide the support that many people are going to continue to need, and probably need in different formats as we come out of pandemic into inevitably very difficult economic situations, and also think about how we create the right environment for that cross-sectoral support to continue, because that is the next challenge ahead of us. And next week we'll be launching our manifesto, which suggests some ideas of how we ensure that environment is in place, to make sure in particular that community organisations are in a position to provide the support that will be required within their communities for the foreseeable future. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Chris. Just in between sessions, we've got Linwin, our interpreter, has just joined us. So we're just going to try and test to see if that's working. So apologies for the technical difficulties. So can everyone see the icon at the bottom now? Yeah, okay. Can you try and switch between English and Welsh and see if you can hear Linwen? Okay, Nikki, you're saying you don't have the icon. Okay, I can hear Linwen. Yeah, some people are working. I think Linwen's saying in the background that if you're on a device, a mobile device, you may not have the icon. So we will keep going for now. Oh, someone's saying click more, then you should see the icon. So click the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen saying more, then you should have the translation icon. Okay, brilliant. All right, thank you. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Duncan Holten from People and Work, who is one of the authors of the report. So over to you, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Emma. Sorry. Let me start again. I'm just trying to get the slideshow up. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm here to talk about the research I did with my colleague Sarah Lloyd-Jones, looking at the community response to COVID-19. This was a primarily qualitative study that involved looking at experiences in Gwynedd and Wrexham, also in Cardiff and Newport in South Wales, and Bridgend and Newport Talbot, and then in the West, Pembrokeshire. And it involved research with communities, so talking to a range of community groups. Many of you, I think, are represented today, also local councillors, volunteers, and others involved in the response. Also talking to community volunteer councils, CVCs in each of those areas, and local authorities to explore the collaboration between those different partners and the ways the community response was organised. What I really want to focus upon today is to look at the response of community groups and mutual aid groups, and to use that as a way of exploring the importance of place-based assets in responding to the crisis, and the ways in which community groups provided a key focus for identifying and mobilising those place-based assets. And then to talk a bit more about how the community response fitted into the much broader national response to the crisis, and what that meant in terms of collaboration between the different layers of what we termed as a kind of multi-layered response to the crisis. So what are place-based assets? Well, we define it fairly broadly as those assets that are somehow tied or linked to a particular place or a particular community. So it's the people in the community, the people with the organizational skills, the leadership skills. It could be people who've got time, for example, due to the furlough scheme, who are able to help. It's also to do with the social capital, the social assets of a community, the extent to which, for example, people in the community know each other. There's trust in the community. There's a sense of community. There might be a culture of people in the community doing things to help other people, which are all really critical in terms of enabling responses, in terms of, for example, identifying those who needed help and linking them to people who could offer help. And also some of the links that community organizations might have with CBCs, with local businesses and others that could help in terms of mobilizing the response. It was also to do with the kind of physical infrastructure or assets of the community. So the buildings, the places that were often important in terms of preparing food parcels, activity packs, and so on. A link to that, the kind of institutional or the organizational assets of a community, and community organizations, which is the focus of this, were really critical in terms of linking up and mobilizing all these assets, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. It was also to do with private businesses and others, and the significance of the foundational economy, I think, comes through from this. And it was also to do with the access to coast and countryside. I think all these assets are really crucial at any time, but COVID-19 really accentuated or increased the importance of those assets because of the limitations on travel and movement. And community organizations and mutual aid groups played a key role in terms of communities being able to make use of and mobilize the assets that they had. In partly, they provided the structures, the organizations that enabled the planning, and also the delivery of support in communities. And that depended upon leadership, and we're using leadership in a very broad sense, not only the leaders of community organizations, but all those people who saw that there was a need and stepped forward and did something to help. So all the volunteers, the people who did things in their communities, I think you can think of those as all community leaders. It was also to do with community networks and social networks, the trust within the communities, the ways in which people in communities exchanged information. They linked up to other people who had things that could help. So the driving school that could offer cars and drivers to help deliver things. All those ways, all those links within the community were critical in terms of linking people who had needs with those people and assets that could help address those needs. The digital infrastructure was obviously critically important, ways in which obviously you couldn't meet, so Zoom, WhatsApp groups, all these things that enable communication and planning to carry on. But it was also clear, while there was a huge amount of volunteering and donations were really critical in terms of enabling this response, it wasn't simply done on the back of local assets. Access to emergency support that was often much easier than it is in the normal times is really important, but also as was advice and support and access to things like PPE. Now, we argue that community response had some real strengths, and I think it really, as Chris was saying, it really illustrates the strengths of a community-based response to community-based organizations. In many ways, it was a very person-centered or perhaps a human-centered approach to the crisis. So you might think about how the National Food Parcel Delivery Scheme being delivered by commercial companies, might drop off a food parcel on a doorstep and then drive off. Whereas a lot of the community groups might also have been dropping off food parcels, but took that as an opportunity to have a socially distanced chat with people on the doorstep, which helped tackle some of the issues around social isolation and loneliness, but also provided opportunities to have a conversation with people about the other types of needs they might have within communities. And that combination of knocking on doors, of talking to people, but also the degree of trust that organizations had in communities and the links they had with people across the communities helped them identify people in communities who were not on anyone's radar. They weren't known to have problems, but emerged during the crisis. Now, some of those people had problems that predated the crisis, and people reflected upon the fact that they thought they knew communities, but they still found people who had difficulties they hadn't known before. And I think in many ways, it meant it was a much more inclusive approach than the approach of many public services, which are often much more targeted upon those people who are already known to services to be vulnerable and met thresholds for intervention or support. So in many ways, a much more inclusive approach. The fact that it was community-based, it was trusted community organizations, also encouraged this huge groundswell of community action and volunteering and so on, and people stepped up to help their communities. And I think alongside that, the nature of the crisis of COVID-19 also helped delegitimize, or sorry, helped take away some of the stigma of asking for help. So it both encouraged people to give help, but also encouraged people to ask for help in ways they perhaps wouldn't have done under other circumstances. Then another key theme is the extent to which community organisations were often able to respond much more swiftly and much more agilely than larger, for example, public sector organisations were, in part because they're smaller, with smaller and flatter hierarchical structures, but also perhaps because they've got less bureaucracy and red tape, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. And they played a key role in terms of helping fill in some of the gaps that were left by public sector responses, but also some of the weaknesses of those responses. So where, for example, food parcels weren't meeting the cultural needs of some BAME communities, local community groups were often able to step in with alternative food parcels. But there were clearly some weaknesses, some constraints, and we would suggest some risks associated with the way community groups responded to it. There's often good reasons why we have red tape and bureaucracy. And I think while the speed and the agility of community organisations was a real strength, it did also raise some concerns around areas like where the corners have been cut around, for example, safeguarding, around the safety of those involved in the response. And in some cases, community groups and organisations were taking risks that larger voluntary sector organisations in the public sector weren't willing to take. And it also raised some concerns around the possible abuse where, for example, pop-up food banks have been established in many ways to kind of circumvent some of the rules and regulations around existing food banks. There were concerns that that might lead to abuse of the system. I think in many ways, the community response exemplified this kind of small is beautiful, but that meant it couldn't be scaled up, and that wouldn't be the point of it. But it also meant you didn't get the opportunities to kind of generate the economies of scale you might get with things like the National Food Distribution Scheme. I think in some cases, the kind of complexity of problems that people were encountering on the doorstep or when people phoned up really challenged them, that the groups often didn't have the skills and experience to deal with the problems that people had, and that added to the emotional demands of the work. I think as well, because place-based assets are unevenly distributed across communities, it meant there was inevitably the response to COVID, the community response to COVID-19 was also very mixed and diverse. And I think finally, there's a degree of fragility in the response, that while many community organisations stepped up, others were shuttered because, for example, they had trustees or staff who were shielding or self-isolating. And I think more broadly, even for those organisations that were involved, the physical and emotional demands of the work were really considerable. And I think there were real concerns about burnout and how long organisations can keep this going. As Chris reflected, it feels like it's never ending at the moment. So there's a degree of fragility with this response, I think. But while I think it's a huge amount to celebrate around the community response, it was really clear it wasn't and couldn't just be a community-led response. I think given the scale and complexity of this needed to be a multi-layered response. And we can think about the responses of Westminster government with the furlough scheme, Welsh government with the shielding letters and so on, national voluntary sector organisations like the Red Cross, the NHS, housing associations, large and small businesses, councils, CVCs, and we'll hear more about the work in Interlink a bit later this morning, community groups and also mutual aid groups all played a key role. And Ben will be talking a bit more about some of these kind of grassroots community-based responses. And I think it was clear that each of those layers was needed. I think one of the questions we explored in the research was to what extent did they need to plan together? And what we found is there was often quite a lot of, with one exception, there was strong partnership working between local authorities, CVCs, and large anchor organisations. And a lot of that was that given the speed of the crisis, a lot of that was perhaps necessarily based upon pre-existing relationships and structures. So, for example, groups and structures set up under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act or resilience forms were used as vehicles to enable that planning. In contrast, much of the work that was done by community groups, mutual aid groups, and what you might just call good neighbourliness, of people just helping one another, happened in parallel to that. I think in many ways that was a real strength of it, that this kind of bottom-up community-led response, because the fact it was decentered was a key strength, but it did also make kind of coordination and understanding how the effectiveness of the responses across Wales much more complex. I think while there wasn't necessarily that involvement in planning, there was, as we noted, a lot of support. So that could be around access to funding, but it could also be advice around things like safeguarding, governance, and also around access to PPE. So did community organisations make a difference? This is one of the key questions we wanted to explore. And I think it's a resounding yes. They made a massive difference, I think, as I've hopefully illustrated or argued this morning, that those assets that were linked to the place, the people, the social trust, the links and so on, the community, the physical infrastructure, the local businesses were all critical, but the ability to mobilize and use those assets really depended upon community organizations, and they played a vital role in terms of identifying needs and linking those to people and assets in those communities who could address those needs. In doing so, I think they shone a spotlight on both some of the vulnerabilities and some of the needs, some of which predated the crisis, some of which emerged during the crisis. But it also, I think, more positively really shone a spotlight upon the strengths and assets of our communities and the potential for community action to really make a difference. And I think that's something that we hope can continue after the crisis. But it was also clear this wasn't simply a bottom-up asset-led approach, that support, be it funding and others, was critical in terms of enabling that. And it was part of a much larger response. So I think in terms of the lessons in relation to how public sector bodies and, for example, large voluntary sector organisations work with smaller community groups and organisations, both during the crisis and hopefully afterwards, I think we need to try and find this sweet spot that's somewhere that doesn't involve kind of top-down command and control, where community groups are being told what to do. We also need to be careful, and there were isolated examples in the study, that other organisations don't undermine or crowd out the work of community organisations or push it to one side. But equally, I think it's not about leaving community organisations on their own to neglect them. And we might want to have a debate about the extent to which community organisations want active involvement. But I think for many, it's not a case of simply neglecting, of leaving them to their own devices. And I think what this needs to help us find that sweet spot to get there is a critical, reflective thinking about, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the different sectors, of the community sector relative to the larger voluntary sector, relative to the public and the private sectors, and also the different levels of responses, and what's the most appropriate organisations, levels and sectors for responding to the type of needs we had during COVID-19, but also beyond. In some cases, it may mean a kind of completely hands-off, do no harm approach of just letting community organisations get on with it. But some community organisations may value and may need help, support, advice and guidance from CVCs, local authorities, larger anchor organisations and others. It may also mean changing relationships. So voluntary sector organisations aren't simply seen as suppliers of services for the public sector, but are much more of a trusted partner. But I also think it will require evaluation for us to really understand both where the gaps are, that we know that place-based assets aren't evenly distributed, that the strength of community responses will have differed from community to community, and we need to understand that better and think about what we can do where it is weak, and also how we can strengthen it where it is good, so it's better still. And also to think about the system as a whole. I think, well, there's an awful lot to celebrate, say, in the response, the emergency responses in relation to food. Arguably, the response in areas like mental health has been weaker. Okay, thank you all very much. I'll stop screen sharing.
Okay. Thank you, Duncan. So now we're going to hear from someone who was right at the heart of the community response to COVID. Ben Gregory works for Group Cynefin, a housing association in North Wales, and he's also a board member of Shop Griffiths, social enterprise in Pen y Groes. So fingers crossed, our technical problems are over. So you should have the globe icon at the bottom. If you don't, look for more or the 3 dots to try and find it, and then switch between the languages to hear the translation. So thanks, over to you, Ben.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, a diolch am y gwahoddiad. Dwi eisiau dweud diolch hefyd I Duncan am y cyflwyno o'r adroddiad, oherwydd mae hwn yn can I cloch efo profiad ni. A dwi'n meddwl, I fod yn onest, y map o Gymru, allai di roi'r pin I mewn un rwle yn Cymru ar o fewn 2 milltir bys ydi wedi ffindio grŵp cymunedol sydd wedi bod yn gweithio yn y modd mae Duncan wedi disgrifio. So, dyn ni'n, Shop Griffiths yn mentor cymdeithasol yn Pen y Groes. Byddwn ni siarad am ein profiad ni, ond hefyd, dyn ni'n gweithio'n agos iawn efo partneriaeth Ogwyn yn Bethesda, a cwmni Bro Ffestiniog yn Blaen Ffestiniog, a dyn ni'n rhan o'r rwydwaith llechi glo a cefn gwlad. So mae hwn yn tebyg i be mae grwpiau yn y rwydwaith yna yn wneud hefyd. Oeddwn ni'n ffodus a dechrau ar y gyfwn Covid i cyflogi 3 person i wneud swyddi gwahanol iawn, ond aethon ni yn syth at ein arianwyr i dweud ydyn nhw'n gallu gweithio ar y ymateb cymunedol i Covid, ac oedd 3 ohonyn nhw, y loteri, franc a'r cyngor, yn dweud oedden nhw'n hapus i bobl i stopio gweithio ar ei swyddi a wedyn symud ymlaen i gweithio ar Covid. A dwi'n meddwl yn ystod y 3 mis cyntaf ar gyfwng, oedd y tîm yn canolbwyntio ar datblygu yr ymateb. Llwyddon ni recrwtio 53 o gwyddolwyr i cefnogi dros 80 o bobl bregus. Oedd sefyllfa yn Gwynedd yn diddorol iawn oherwydd oedd lot o grwpiau wedi dechrau trwy cynghorwyr lleol, ac hwn oedd y polisi gan y cyngor i trio i sefydlu grwpiau cefnogi. Ond cawson ni enghraifft yn y pentre nesaf i ni, lle doedd y cynghorydd ddim yn wneud hynny. So oeddwn ni'n ehangu be oeddwn ni'n wneud. So mae wedi bod yn patchy, ond mae bobl wedi llenwi bylch hefyd. Hefyd dwi'n meddwl, dyn ni wedi bod yn wneud be mae lot o bobl wedi bod yn wneud efo prescriptions, y siopa, rhoi galwader i bobl. Ond eto be oedd Duncan yn dweud, ffindio ni oedd yn rhoi lot o pwysau ar ein gweithwyr, cos mae nhw bobl eitha ifanc. Dwi'n gweld lot o bobl yn ifanc yn erbyn dyddi hwn. Ond so oedd angen i ni mynd i mudiad arall i cefnogi nhw, cos oedden nhw'n deilio efo pethau reit emotional ac yn bodro ar cwmsel y weithiau. So oedd angen i ni i cefnogi nhw i cefnogi bobl hefyd. Ac oedd nhw'n rhan o beth oedden ni trio i datblygu. Mae cyfnod wedi bod yn un od iawn, yn arbennig yn ariannol, cos eto beth sy'n yn y droddiad, mae lot o pres wedi mynd i mewn i cefnogi grwpiau i ymateb i Covid ac i roi y cefnogaeth oedd angen i roi. Ond ar y llaw arall, mae lot o grwpiau, maen nhw dal yn trio i wneud be oedden nhw'n wneud cyn Covid, a mae hwn wedi bod yn anodd, a mae arian wedi bod yn prin iawn yn arbennig i datblygu pethau newydd. So, os dwi'n siarad tipyn bach am partneriaeth Ogwyn a chwmni Bwrdd Ffestiniog rwan, yn Bethesda ar y cyffiniau, oedden nhw wedi recrwtio dros 100 o bobl, 100 o gwyddolwyr o fewn wythnosau. Oedden nhw'n cefnogi busnesau hefyd. Maen nhw wedi sefydlu Cadwyn Ogwyn, sydd wedi rhoi y cyfle i busnesau i gwerthu pethau ar-lein. Oedd lot o bobl yn poeni am pethau yn symud ar-lein a mynd i busnesau tu allan yr ardal. A maen nhw'n meddwl maen nhw wedi cadw dros 35,000 yn y cymuned oherwydd Cadwyn Ogwyn. Oedden nhw defnyddio cerbydau y tîm hefyd i danfon y bwyd i bobl. Oedd sefydlodd y cymuned banc bwyd yn ystod y Covid, a maen nhw wedi dosbarthu dros 1,000 o parseli yn ystod yr amser yna. Maen nhw'n dosbarthu bwyd trwy yr adeilad hefyd, a maen nhw wedi dechrau danfon bwyd pwyth i bobl. Un peth mae Bethesda wedi wneud, partneriaeth Ogwyn a cwmni Bwrdd Ffestiniog, yw i casglu gwybodaeth gan y cymuned. Maen nhw wedi cael holiadur cymunedol, ac mae yn ôl yr un yn Bethesda, mae 82% o bobl yn teimlo maen nhw fel rhan o'r cymuned, sy'n ffigur uchel iawn, dwi'n meddwl. A 83% yn meddwl oedd nhw'n gwybod lle i troi i cael cefnogaeth. A dwi'n meddwl, os oeddwn ni wedi dweud hynny cyn Covid, bys ni ffindio fo anodd i credu, ond dwi'n meddwl mae bobl wedi weld werth grwpiau cymunedol a maen nhw'n gwybod lle i fynd drwy. Yn cwmni Bwrdd Ffestiniog, mae hwn yn model gwahanol, cos mae cwmni Bwrdd Ffestiniog yn grŵp ymbrel ar gyfer cyfres o fentre cymdeithasol yn ardal Ffestiniog. Mae un o'r, erbyn hyn, maen nhw'n cyflogi 140 o bobl yn y mentre cymdeithasol gwahanol. Oedd lot o'i gweith nhw yn troi at ymateb i Covid. Mae un o partneriaid drefwerth wedi cymryd be oedden nhw'n wneud o blaen, sef i gweithio a pethau fel clodi tanwydd, clodi bwyd, helpu bobl fe bilia, a symud ymlaen i ymateb ar gyfon Covid. So maen nhw wedi dosbarthu bwyd, maen nhw wedi cyflogi ymgysylltwyr cymunedol, a maen nhw'n newid eu gwasanaeth nhw rwan i ymateb i heriau'r y dyfodol. So mae Covid wedi cael dylanwad mawr o be maen nhw'n wneud. I ni yn Siop Griffiths, mae wedi bod yn amser really odd, cos da ni wedi mynd o cyflogi 3 person i 8 person yn ystod Covid, oherwydd ar geilydd yr arian i cefnogi gwasanaethau cymunedol. Hefyd, da ni wedi cymryd mwy cyfrifoldeb, oeddwn ni'n efo caffi cymunedol, a oeddwn ni'n gosod o'n trwyddyd. O beth dwi'n gallu weld, mae'n amosib i busnesau fel hynny i wneud unrhyw pres y dyddiau yma. So, da ni wedi cyflogi y staff oedd yn gweithio yn y caffi a derbyn y colledion yn y tymor fer i sicrhau mae gwasanaeth lleol i bobl. Yr un peth efo, mae gennym ni llety cymunedol. Dydy ddim wedi agor oherwydd Covid, so da ni'n wynebu 15,000 o colledion yn ystod y flwyddyn. Mae rai arian wedi bod ar gael y gyfer hynny, ond mewn ffordd, os da ni'n sbio ar y dyfodol, a dwi'n siŵr mae hwn yr un peth o gyfer lot o grwpiau, bydd ar gyfwng ariannol ni, nid rwan, a nid flwyddyn nesaf, neu mewn 2 flynedd, pan oedd ni'n disgwyl incwm i dod i mewn eleni i creu cronfa ar gyfer y dyfodol, bydd o'n ddim yna. So, bydd her i ni falle mewn 2 flynedd. Ond i fod yn cadarnhaol, yn ystod y cyfnod ers mis Mawrth diwetha, da ni wedi cyflogi swyddog awyr agored i cynnal gweithgareddau Covid diogel, oherwydd mae mwy o bobl eisiau mynd tu allan. Da ni wedi cyflogi swyddog bwyd y lles i datblygu gwasanaethau mae lot o grwpiau wedi wneud ar draws Cymru i cefnogi bobl efo anghenion a bwyd. Ac da ni eisiau, a rwan da ni trio i chwilio am arian i sicrhau mae gwasanaethau hwn yn parhau, cos bydd y problemau yn dechrau pan mae bobl yn meddwl mae Covid yn drosodd. Cos bydd y lot o arian sy'n yn y rwan i cefnogi hynny yn diflannu, ond byddwn ni'n wynebu yr gyfwng economaidd sy'n wynebu ni yn y misoedd a blynyddoedd nesaf. Un peth bys ni daid yw mae wedi bod yn hanfodol i ni i ymateb i cydweithio efo bobl eraill. So, efo Bethesda blaen a trwy rwydwaith llechi glo cefn gwlad, a mae wedi cael effaith mawr arnyn ni, y profiad o rannu gwybodaeth a rannu be da ni'n wneud. A trwy rannu y gwybodaeth yna, da ni'n newydd cael arian i agor canolfan pobl ifanc fentrus i prynu'r adeilad drws nesaf. A fase hwn ddim wedi digwydd, un o'r pethau od am y rwydwaith yna, cyn Covid, bys ni wedi cwrdd 4 gwaith y flwyddyn. Rwan da ni cwrdd bob wythnos. A oherwydd hynny, da ni'n gallu ymateb yn lot mwy sydyn. So bydd yn digwydd ar ôl Covid, dwi ddim yn gwybod. Cos mae cyswllt wythnosol wedi bod yn pwysig iawn i ni. Efo cefnogaeth da ni wedi cael tu allan, mae ariannwyr wedi bod yn hyblyg iawn. Mae cefnogaeth gan asiantaethau. Mewn ffordd, does dim byd wedi newid. O blaen, os oedd y cyngor yn cefnogol neu adran yn cefnogol, oedden nhw dal yn cefnogol. Os doedden nhw ddim, dwi ddim yn meddwl o Covid wedi newid lot. A really, mae'n dibynnu lle ydych chi'n byw, a pam ddylai grwpiau cymunedol yn cael cefnogaeth efo, mae'n fel lottery postcode. Os mae bobl yn cefnogol lle ydych chi'n byw, gred. Os dydyn nhw ddim, mae'n rili anodd i newid y ffordd maen nhw'n meddwl a gweithio. Dwi eisiau gorffen, oherwydd weithiau dwi'n meddwl, da ni mewn bybl bach a does neb arall yn sylwi be mae grwpiau cymunedol yn wneud a siwr dyn ni wedi ymateb. Ond o'n i'n datlen golwg bore yma, mynd i wedi dod allan heddiw. Ac mae cyn pennaeth yr amgueddfa llechi yn Llanberis yn sgwennu yn golwg heddiw. A mae, dyn ni'n rhan eto, mae cymuned ni a Blaena a Bethesda, dyn ni wedi bod yn rhan o ymateb yr ymgynghori cymunedol i cais UNESCO i cael safle treftadaeth y byd i'r ardaloedd llechi. Mae'n cael ei penderfynu yn mis Gorffennaf. Ond mae David Roberts yn dweud hwn yn golwg, so jyst i cael dyfyniad bach. So mae'n dweud, mae rhywun yn medru gweld y gwaith da sydd wedi cael ei wneud eisoes, meddwl fo. Enghraifft, yn Antistiniog, sy'n blaen Festiniog, a'r y mentra cymdeithasol sy'n digwydd ar yr ardal honno, a mae pethau tebyg yn Dyffryn Ogwen a Dyffryn Nantlle ar y funud. Mae rhywun angen gweld mwy o hynny a'r hyder yn llifo yn ôl i'r brywydd yma. A dwi'n meddwl, dyna beth sy'n yn yr adroddiad, dydy. Mae'n dangos y ffyrdd mae cymunedau wedi ymateb i Covid ar y heriau, a mae rai ohonyn nhw yn dychrynllyd y heriau dyn ni'n wynebu yn y flynyddoedd nesaf. Ond mae'n dangos hefyd yr hyder sydd wedi dod o cydweithiau rhwng cymunedau, a dwi'n meddwl bod un o'r prif pethau i dod allan y cyfnod presennol. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Ben. Diolch yn fawr. Just to remind everyone that if you've got any questions on what you've heard from Chris, Ben and Duncan so far, please pop them in the Q&A icon at the bottom. So now we're going to move on from the community to the county-wide response. So we've got Julie Edwards and Tyler Davis from Interlink, which is the CVC for Rhondda Cynon Taf. They're going to give us a wider perspective on COVID response and talk a little bit about some similar research that they're doing as well.
Good morning, guys. Julie's just sharing our our presentation. So yeah, good morning. I'm Tyler May Davis. I'm the Community Hub Development Coordinator at Interlink, which is RCT's CVC. And my colleague here is Julie Edwards, who is, bear with me, I'm just trying to pull up my notes from my presentation.
I'm the Community Advice Team leader.
There we go. Thank you. Today we'd like to talk to you about 4 things. The first thing, we want to set the scene. At Interlink, we like to take people on a journey to explain the story of how the CVC has responded. So that's what we'll come on to next. And then thirdly, we'd like to share some of our research and our research title and some of our initial findings. Next slide, Julie.
Thanks, Tyler. I'll just pick up on this just to set the scene a little bit. You'll be able to see on the screen that we've got details of the storms that hit Rhondda Cynon Taf and much of Wales in February. But what probably people won't realise is that it was actually the wettest year on record that winter. So 2019 into 2020, the residents of RCT in particular never thought that what they were going to experience for the next, well, what was turned out for the whole of 2020 was what was going to be facing them at the start of January. So the record started in 1862 and 2020 was the wettest. The land was saturated and rivers were full. So by the time February came and Storm Ciara hit, people were already worried that the floodwaters were going to hit their homes. When Dennis came, Dennis really was a menace, and he did absolutely ruin lots of people's lives in RCT. Just to put that into context, there were 3,000 properties flooded, 2,765 of them were in Rhondda Cynon Taf. Just to set that scene, you can imagine the devastation that was caused. So the River Rhondda, River Cynon feed into the River Taf. These rivers were full. They were bringing shipping containers down with them. That's how fluid and the amount of water that was coming down these rivers. It was at the peak, the River Taff was at its highest level since 1968. And it was estimated that 805 cubic meters passed through Pontypridd at this highest point. Put that into context again, that's an Olympic-sized swimming pool being filled in 3 seconds. That's how much water came through Pontypridd. That also then, if anybody is familiar with the Pontypridd area, you know that where these rivers meet, we've also got the Lido. So that was completely devastated by the amount of water that just, filled the whole of Ynys and Carrad Park as a result of this as well. What the flooding done though was allow for a bit of a dry run for our communities. So lots of community groups responded to the flooding and the devastation that it caused. Groups set up from nothing. Community centres opened up as almost emergency points for people to pick up, materials for, cleaning up, clothing, bedding, because of course all of their items downstairs were gone. They'd gone down the river. So the storms were very unkind. Lots of community groups though had to respond back in February and kept going, because then the other storms that followed impacted on people's emotional, mental well-being, and so forth. The response went on. That, as a CVC, Interlink RCT, it allowed us to get a feel for what the community groups were doing, how they were responding, and what needed to happen moving forward. So it was very much a practice run, if you like, and forgive me for the term, of what was to come. And I'll just pass on to Tyler for the next one.
Thank you. Yeah, so we can see historically, we were going through this first crisis in RCT, and then we hit the second crisis of the pandemic. I think Julie used the term dry run for the community members, but it also enabled the CVC to see how the community were reacting, and kind of tailor how we were working within Interlink. We have 2 separate teams within Interlink, and although we do collaborate on lots of different projects, it did bring about a much stronger collaboration between the two teams. We have the community advice team and the wellbeing team. When we went into the pandemic, we moved to working from home, and the wellbeing team, what we found, they were getting telephone consultations, and normally they would meet face to face with the patients and people that were being referred into them via the GPs, people that were referring themselves in at this point. So then they would work with the community advice team, who had a lot more contact and a lot more partnerships with some of the community groups and knew what was going on, so we could advise people and support them through that process. Some of the services that the community advice team were really focusing on was that volunteering support. We had an inordinate amount of volunteers coming through from the flooding, and that then carried on through into the pandemic. So we were setting up volunteer support. We also at Interlink started a micro grant, so we could then feed that down into the community group and organisations so they could access funding, and then we would also signpost people into other forms of funding, and also help them to set up some of that governance to get some of that funding quickly, because as we had learnt from the floods, we needed to turn around response to be very quick. We didn't need it next week, we needed it yesterday, and therefore Interlink were able to put those procedures in place to be able to offer that support. We also offered a lot of advice and guidance, and like I've already said, support to the community groups and the organisations themselves. So kind of looking at that approach, we as a team, we decided we needed to update our research resource database, and make that really accessible for those community groups and anybody supporting those community groups also. We were working in partnership with RCT as well, the CBC, and then also we thought, you know, the most important thing is we need to learn from this, and how do we grow as a city, how do we grow as a an area, how do the community groups grow, how do we develop, and how do we put stuff into procedure going forward, make sure that we learn and put things in place. So we decided that we would do a piece of research and action research, and I'll just move on to that. So Julie, next slide please. This is our research question. How do we collaborate to support a whole systems approach to support community-led responses to increase resilience? I thought I would put up the definition here of a whole systems approach. It is responding to complexity through a dynamic way of working, bringing in stakeholders, including community, and together to develop a shared understanding of the challenge, to integrate action and bring around sustainable and long-term systems. So that's our question. It is not as simple as you might think it is, and you know, Duncan's covered a lot of what our findings have been within his presentation as well. The process we went along for this research is we named it the Really Big Listening Project, and back in July we went out into the community to interview individuals, groups and public sector staff. So together we interviewed 44 community groups who were active within the first lockdown of COVID, 19 individuals, some of which had received from community groups and RCT, and some of which that hadn't received anything. So we were able to get that cross perspective of support and no support. And then we also spoke to 10 RCT public sector staff as well to find out their experiences. I think, you know, while we were in the thick of it and community groups, we were reacting to everything was going on, and probably sometimes we didn't get to speak so much to other organisations to find out what they were doing. So that is what we did. And you know, I'll just go on to the next slide, Julie. Thank you. So after going out and speaking to all of these people, we then pulled all of these interviews back in. I think it's 71, but I may be miscalculating there, and went through the process then of finding some themes, of common themes that we could pull out from each of those interviews. You know, the stories were absolutely amazing. The amount of that we owe to volunteers, to community groups, was really shown up in every single interview, that people could not thank the volunteers, the community groups enough for what they've done. They really set a precedence of, you know, that community need and what they needed. So, you know, coming back to some of those themes now, we found three main building blocks, as Duncan was calling it before, of how to come back to that research question of how do we support that whole systems approach, and what building blocks did our community and RCT have to be able to go forward and tackle those two crises that we've been through in the last year now. The first was Storm Dennis, giving us procedures already in place, being able to react quickly to those crises. We also pulled out the theme of volunteering and paid staff. The amount of volunteers I've just said, absolutely amazing, and paid staff who were working from home, or just the amount that they went through. You know, I read through a quote, and one of the paid staff said that no was not a word that was used very often. And that's the same for the volunteering. Everybody just did what they needed to do to support everybody. We had another theme that kind of came out with that Duncan touched upon was anchor organisations and how they were a hub for some advice and support. Funding was another one of those building blocks that feels that comes under the foundation and local community partnerships. Funding was a positive. A lot of funders removed some of the admin that was attached to original bids. They released smaller bids that were easier to access and quickly then fed down into the community, which is what they needed. Governance, because that unique situation that we found ourselves in, some of the governance around emergency centres and setting up food banks and fair share and things like that, that was already in place from Storm Dennis. So that was already there. So that was a great building block. The timeline also, we went straight from one crisis into another. So there wasn't much of a let up there. Actions that needed to happen for successful collaboration. Under that theme, we have the massive partnership and networks and communication there. A lot of these community groups already had existing partnerships and networks that were formed, either historically way before 2020, but some of the partnerships and the networks were formed around the Storm Dennis and then carried on through. Then there was also some networks that were set up, that community groups set up during the pandemic. And then they could reach out across the whole of our city, supporting people a lot on the media side of thing and Facebook groups, where groups could feed in and support other groups. And communication, what is very clear, what came out from the research is that community groups tried every single method of communicating to get out to people the services that they were providing. Leaflets were dropped, phone calls were made. One interview said that he was walking past the village hall and bumped into the community leader who, they were out for their daily walks and they started talking there, and they got involved with volunteering. The other big theme that was pulled out is the need, that was probably the need from Storm Dennis that we knew, but also I think it was just common sense that what that needed would have been. The biggest need obviously was food, so food networks were set up, and also the need to who we were reaching, that target group. We had RCTCBC who were very much concentrating on reaching the 11,500 people that were shielding, and so therefore community groups were looking at who else needed support, and reaching them through those methods of contact and offering them their services. What I haven't put up here, but is obviously barriers. Our research is trying to look at that whole system approach of what things work to build on the community led resilience. But what is very clear that's come out of our research is that there is a lot of barriers that have been put in place, and that is going to be highlighted within our things. Some of those were locations and buildings, they were being shut down. Groups moved to garages at people's houses to distribute food. Mental health is, you could do a whole study on mental health and the impact of that alongside isolation and loneliness. Funding also did come up as a bit of a barrier for some groups. They didn't know where to get funding, and it was slow coming down. So therefore, by the time they were trying to meet the need of the community, it wasn't there anymore. And also communication came up from some individuals who didn't receive help or support from groups or the local authority because they didn't know where to look. They didn't know how to ask for help. So those are our initial findings. We do still have a lot of work to do on our report. Thank you for putting that on there. Yeah, we still do have a lot of work to do on the report, and those are initial findings. We're hoping to get the report out in a very, very good draft form by the end of March. So as soon as that comes out, I will send that over to Emma so she can distribute it out to anybody. If anybody has any questions, Julie's has put our email addresses on there, so feel free to contact us as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie and Tyler. So we've got a few minutes left. I think people have been answering questions in the chat. If anyone's got any questions now, pop them in the chat and we can use these last few minutes to try and answer them. Okay, somebody's asked in the chat, not in the Q&A, what data system did you use that could be shared with local authority and CVC in the community hub? I guess that's a question for Julie and Tyler.
I was just passing that over to Julie there. Would you like to take that one?
Sorry, Emma, I missed the question. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sure. So Gwyneth asked in the chat, what data system did you use that could be shared with local authority and CVC in the community hub?
I think, as Tyler mentioned, there were things that proved as a challenge because, data sharing is, with the complexity of GDPR and things like that, then, we can't do some of that data sharing. So it was reliant then on the community hubs that RCT themselves had, community resilience centres, they were called, from RCT. They were set up, and then that reliance on them working out with ourselves and networking across community groups to get that information. So it wasn't a formal structure in that sense, and it wasn't the handling of information direct. It was more about connecting so that the people got the right support that they needed, or community groups had access to information.
Okay, thank you. Chris, were you going to answer a question live?
Yeah, sorry, I must do now and press the wrong button. There's a question from Hugh Lewis, I think at Gavo, making a really interesting point about doing local authority, about CDCs doing local authority level research, which I think I understand why you want to do that. But I was just going to say it might be worth checking in with Interlink directly about their experience. And certainly Duncan and I would be happy to share any experiences we've got, but Interlink have actually led the way in CVC research. It might be a good starting point for that.
Okay, thank you. I can see that all the questions were answered live or by typing, so I think we'll end the session there. So thanks so much for everyone who came to the webinar today. Apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but hopefully you all could hear by the end. Thanks so much to the panelists, Chris, Duncan, Ben, Julie and her very cute dog that kept making an appearance, and Tyler. And just to flag up 2 events that BCT are running next week. So we're launching our manifesto for strong Welsh communities ahead of the Senedd elections. And we're also going to be talking about the possibility of setting up a community movement for Wales. So when I email everyone who came today the slides, I'll also pop some links in there if you wanted to book onto some of those sessions if you're interested. So diolch yn fawr, thank you very much.